Okay, so our starting point for today is the public art policy, which was the first initiative of its kind in the city and sought to provide a framework and a rationale for a citywide public art program, as well as guidelines and protocols for its implementation. It was progressive and hugely impactful, as we'll hear from several of our speakers today. And thanks to provisions like the Percent for Public Art, which stipulates that up to 1% of the construction budget of all major city building projects of 10 million rand or more be devoted to public art, the commissioning of art in public spaces became enmeshed with urban development in Joburg in the early and mid-2000s. This had many tangible positive effects for the art industry, the built environment, and the diverse publics who use and inhabit the city. And at the very least, the art that has been commissioned in Johannesburg in the past 20 years has been a fascinating document of artists and other stakeholders' readings and interpretations of the city and its publics. I'm sure most of us are familiar with pieces such as Clive van den Berg's Eland in Braamfontein, the Jutta Street Trees, Gerrit Marx and William Kentridge's Firewalker, and Usha Seegerum's figures representing the Freedom Charter in the Walter Sisulu Square of Dedication in Kliptown. Alongside these landmark interventions, there are grassroots practices, community-led aesthetic interpretations of urban space, and ephemeral ways of artistic organizing that play an equally important role in mediating and producing the city. All artworks operate as carriers of meanings in different levels, and part of our task here today is to begin to unpack and understand those levels and their contexts as they interface with Johannesburg's public spheres. We're lucky to have as our speakers today artists, curators, and urbanists who've worked directly with these projects and more. Stephen Sack, who will be the first to present, has worked on landmark curatorial projects since the 1980s and served as Director of Art, Culture and Heritage Services at the City of Johannesburg between 2004 and 2013. Do I have that right?
I remember.
Okay. He played a leading role in creating and instituting the public art policy, collaborating closely with him over the years, several years, with Stephen Hobbs, a co-founder of the Trinity Session, which was an artist-run organization that worked together with the city and the Johannesburg Development Agency as the commissioning agent of a great proportion of the artworks that now exist in the city's public art portfolio. Offering another vital perspective, Usha Seegerum approaches public art in Johannesburg as a maker and thinker and has worked extensively on commissions that bring the past and present lives of the city into conversation. And finally, also presenting from her perspective as an artist, Iyo Makandal expands the scope of urban publics and infrastructures through a practice that makes space for more than human, others, and hybrid natural cultural ecosystems. Okay, I'm just checking my time. All right, I have a few more minutes. When we think about the effects of public art in the city, it's important to consider the passage of time and the phases of development, transformation, regression, success, and failure that time holds. Johannesburg has always been a city in transition. I'm sure the same can be said of many other cities, particularly in the global south, but there are particular dynamics in play here that contribute to this distinctive volatility. The search for post-apartheid urban identity, cycles of economic boom and bust, migration, chapters of gentrification, struggles with leadership and governance, and related infrastructural collapse have together produced cultures of social, economic, and spatial improvisation that are wildly heterogeneous. This heterogeneity has been theorized by Sarah Nuttall and Achille Mbembe as an elusive metropolitanism and is the subject of many scholarly sense-making attempts since the mid-2000s. For me, one of the most interesting of these has been Abdulmalik Simone's 2004 essay, People as Infrastructure, which is included in Nuttall and Mbembe's 2008 volume, Johannesburg, the Elusive Metropolis. Simone calls for an understanding of urban infrastructure that incorporates the social relations that exist in the urban fabric. Expanding the concept of infrastructure beyond manufactured material or built systems that underpin and facilitate social relations, he argues that ways of living and the social relations that issue from them are themselves productive and structuring systems. These social relations give form to urban life in important ways, and for this reason, the notion of the public, or publics, and that of infrastructure are co-implicated. Furthermore, if we acknowledge that interpersonal networks function as infrastructures, as Simone argues, I believe we also need to consider how infrastructures are shaped by natural and more than human elements of urban life, such as waterways, green spaces, and urban fauna. It's a good time to consider how art in Johannesburg, and perhaps more distantly too, engages with these multivalent infrastructures and publics, both human and more than human. In that spirit, what I propose for us to keep in mind throughout today's presentations and conversations is a picture of publicness and infrastructure that is diverse and plural, so publics and infrastructures. By now it might be jarring that I've chosen to keep art in the singular in the title of this symposium. Why not arts? My intention in setting up this perhaps artificial separation between art and arts is to highlight the operation of the contemporary art world, and specifically the world of public art, as a form of infrastructure. Here I understand the art world as a set of conventions and practices that coalesce around the visual, but also exceed it. To my mind, the high level of visibility of many public artworks in Johannesburg and their entanglement with the development of the built environment demand a particular or genre-specific engagement. There are certainly particularities of visual art in the public sphere that are not transferable to other disciplines, and vice versa. In future research, it would be interesting to test some of the ideas we air today in the context of artistic disciplines, and this investigation is a good starting point. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Stephen Sack briefly. You can find his full bio in the documents that are floating around. If you can't find one ready to hand, just lean over someone and borrow theirs. You also should have received the program all digitally, so you can refer to it there. Stephen Sack is an artist, curator, and independent consultant in the areas of the arts, museums, and cultural policy, and is the managing director of the Cape Town Science Centre. Sorry, here I have the date, a different date, from 2003 to 2013, 2003-2004. He worked at the City of Johannesburg as the director of the Department of Arts, Culture and Heritage Services. He's worked as CEO of the Origin Centre, University of the Witwatersrand, and is an honorary fellow of the Wits City Institute, as well as an executive associate of Dijon Design Consulting, who've been commissioned to develop the National Museum of Lesotho. In 1988, he curated the Watershed exhibition, The Neglected Tradition, Towards a History of Black South African Art at the Johannesburg Art Gallery, and much more. So over to you. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. And yeah, thank you so much for setting the stage so clearly. So I have presumed that everybody in this room is familiar with public art in Johannesburg. Not all of it, but certainly the works that I'm going to talk about you'll be familiar with. And so I'm not going to present any images, and there are going to be cases in which that's going to be very frustrating to you, because you're going to have to use your imaginations if you don't know the visual reference that I am referring to. Part of the problem has to do with the fact that, a confession, I have attempted in my, firstly, how old is Johannesburg this year? 140. How old am I? I turned 75 this year. This is like ridiculous, this kind of, so when I was born, the place was like, 65 years old. When my father came, it was 30. When my grandparents came, it was 2 years old. This is an extraordinary place because it is so young, and I don't think there's ever been so much energy packed into a single city on the planet. There was an area called the PWV when I grew up. You know what the PWV is, okay? Pretoria, Witwatersrand, Vereeniging. And what determined the PWV? Where the mines were. So all the networks were determined by where the mines were. And what was my first encounter with public space and public performance? On Sundays, we used to get into the car and we used to go to the mine where there was a compound and an arena, and we used to watch mine dancers, Sotho men, Zulu men, Xhosa men, Malawians, all wearing costume, doing their dances in this public arena. So it's an extraordinary history with an extraordinary past. And when we started doing the public art policy, in a sense, there was no public art. And I'm going to tease out this definition, starting with the eland. So you all know the eland. So as we stand in front of the eland, the top on Bertha Street, where is the other eland? Walking distance from that eland. So I'll take you, we'll walk down Jorrison Street. We'll come to an impenetrable barrier. Can't get onto the campus. You can only really get on if you're in a motor car. So we'll hitch a ride and we'll get onto the campus. You can't get into the Origin Centre unless you pay. And inside you will see the dying eland. Okay, taxidermy at its high. It's probably the most recent animal that was put through a taxidermy treatment, because the museum is not that old, and they stopped doing stuffed animals in museums. So, and you stand in front of that animal, and you watch the film, and you sort of die a little bit because you watch the animal dying. You witness the hunter hunting the animal, and it's a very, very powerful encounter. So the point that one is making with this is that behind every piece of public art, there's a story. There's a story to be told. And so if there are 500 public artworks across the city, and there is a register of all of them, Eric Itzkin has produced it, and I must open this by paying tribute to Eric, because I was the director. I got to travel to New York to go to a conference on public art. Eric stayed at home. When I came back, Eric got to write the policy based on what I had learned in New York, okay? And he wrote, Eric is there'll have to be an artwork to him at some point, at an appropriate time, because he is public art in Johannesburg. And without Eric, and others, but Eric was absolutely central in the project of delivering public art. So I make this point that there's an eland in Origin Centre versus the eland on Bertha Street, offering stories and many thoughts. And so there's a public eland and a private eland behind security and a ticket office. Okay? And you start with just that example. Just remember the role of the church, Corpus Christi, the whole notion of Corpus Christi, where you would carry the object out of the church, and it would be a parade, and that would become carnival, okay? And then it would go back into the church. So there are ways in which there's an interface between public institutions and public space, but certainly not in the history of South Africa. Museums are always inaccessible, are only public at a very late stage in our 140-year story. So I'm from the Origin. If you go to the Origin Centre, I don't know how many of you know that next door to it is the Evolutionary Sciences Institute with the Philip Tobias Fossil Vault, where there is the most valuable collection of human ancestry. It's about the size of this room. It's got the biggest fossil record on the planet. So it's a perfect place to start if you're trying to unpack the deep time story of what is a public And where does this notion begin? So the next institution that I travel to in my mind and in my memory is the East London Museum. Have any of you ever been to the East London Museum? It's a classic, old-fashioned museum. It's about ships and shipwrecks. It's about causes and Khoisan. It's about art and culture and social history. And it's about oceanography and fish, butterflies. It's a fabulous, the best kind of museum. Sadly, we had this obsession post-94 that we needed to destroy all of those kinds of museums and modernize them. And we've just lost so much in that process. So, and in that museum is an extraordinary fossil. And it's called a trace fossil. So it's a trace fossil because it records an encounter on a beach 124,000 years ago. And on that day, across that beach, there walked a child, 7 to 9 years old, a scrub hare, an African black oyster catcher, they think, and they think a mongoose, all traversing a piece of public beach on the same day. It is this, the first example of public space located at the water's edge, that I think constitutes the beginning of us trying to understand what is the public domain, what is public space, okay? And when I was sharing this with other people, they instantly say, absolutely, Muizenberg. It's the most public space in Cape Town. You go to that, or you go to many beaches, go to Durban Beach. It's kind of overwhelmingly public, okay? But the interesting thing about the spaces at the water's edge is that the sand knew that you would never put your homestead next to the body of water. Okay? You wouldn't go and put your little house on the edge of the water because that is public space. Okay? So what I want to suggest is in us trying to understand what is the evolution. Just remember, we have a history on the Southern Cape of human presence at least 100,000 years, we know. We've got evidence of people living, Homo sapiens, living in that region for 100,000 years. We think we might even have evidence that goes up to 250,000 years, because we have evidence of what they were eating, okay? At Pinnacle Point in Mossel Bay. At Blombos, we have the Perlman Shell, where we've got an ochre kit, where people are processing materials, okay? So we've got this deep time story. So those people, what constituted public space? So rock art in the landscape. The gongs, the rock gongs that they have in the landscape. The place where the trance dance is performed. Okay? The tree under which the community gathers in both Bantu tribes and the Khoi and the San and the Bushmen, which there are groups of people who we can quite validly refer to as Bushmen. They call themselves Bushmen. They lived in and off the bush. So you've got these environments that are the spaces of public engagement, okay, where forms of public performance, public dialogue can all take place. So when you go to East London, because what happened is there were some workers from the council were sitting on the beach and they were under an overhang and they looked up and they saw in the overhang the trace of these footprints. And they reported it, and a year or two later it fell. So it's a piece of stone like that. So what happens, you had the footprints, and then this rock formed over the footprints, and so you have this negative mold of these footprints. So you also have, when you go to East London, the opportunity to go next door to the Anne Bryant Art Gallery, which is the only art gallery that has a portrait of William Wordsworth, the only portrait of William Wordsworth. And William Wordsworth is interesting because so these footprints are it's about walking. And when I worked at the Origin Centre, it was always very interesting for people to grapple with the notion that we walked out of Africa. People are like, how the hell do you walk out of Africa? Well, the fact of the matter is that that's all we did 100,000 years ago. We walked. That's what we did. And we walked vast distances, okay? And we walked over periods of time. So the archaeological record might show the presence of humans now, then in 30 years' time, then in 100 years' time, because people are walking, they're moving along that water's edge. And they obviously have a life that constitutes moments of privacy and intimacy, and then lives that constitute a public space and a public engagement. So I start to sort of develop a set of keywords that I'm not going to read to you now, but I then started to think, okay, so how does it then, in the context of Johannesburg and the PWV, because that's, I think, what we're now talking about. The important thing about the public art policy of Joburg is that it enabled the likes of Stephen Hobbs and his company to then work throughout South Africa. They got work in the Eastern Cape, there was work in Tshwane, there was work that happened all over as a result of Johannesburg's public policy. So when I look at it, it's Joburg and this larger environment of, Mamelodi, Soweto, etc. Okay. So I then started to say, okay, if we've got this first beginning, that the public space, there's also a very interesting way in the way in which the agricultural fair is, when I did the neglected tradition, I identified the earliest acquisition of art by black artists came through the agricultural fairs. That's where Kwabe and the Zulu clay workers, that's where they traded their artifacts. Woodwork, grasswork, clay work was brought to the agricultural fair. So there are these early public spaces that constitute the gathering and the reproduction of art. So then I started to think, okay, what's the next critical moment? And I'm suggesting it's Union. It's 1910. It's the construction of the Union buildings. Now, you all know the Union buildings has two wings. And what do the wings symbolize? Two languages. The English and the Afrikaners. That's what the Union symbolizes. So the public space is the public space of the union of the English and the Afrikaners. Okay. Complete exclusion of everybody else. Okay. So under union, we have monuments and memorials. We start having, and I mean, you guys have done a whole lot of interesting research you've done about, and you continue to do about this kind of period. So there's a particular form to the public art. There are particular stories that are told, and there are a whole lot of stories that aren't told under Union. After Union, the next moment is Republic. Now, it's such a wonderful word, because it first gives us the word public to play with. It's called the Republic, and there's nothing republic about it at all, because it is, in fact, the apartheid republic, in which there's nothing public is allowed to incorporate all the peoples of South Africa. So it's a nothing public period. Okay. So now, just by the way, this is new work for me. And so a lot of these are ideas that I'm sharing with you because they need further work, they need further research, and I'm not a full-time academic. And I was going to share with you the fact that I tried to do an MA 3 times. I still don't have an MA to my name. So there's Union, Republic. Now, at the end of the Republic, in the 1980s, it's an extraordinary time because the revolution happens in 1984. Okay, because it's a national revolution. 76 in bits and pieces. 84 is the national revolution that happens. There's an uprising in every community across the country. We don't know about it because we don't get to see the TV, the films. Okay, most of it is not shown on TV. So we don't realize the extent of it. But I was at UNISA and I was seconded to Soweto to set up an art school in Soweto so that black students who wanted to study through UNISA had studios. So in 1984, during the height of the state of emergency, I was traveling in and out of Soweto. So the notion of public art and of a new public that was starting to announce the post-94 world we would live in starts from the 1970s. Okay? So the establishment of the Market Theatre, the establishment of a whole lot of not-for-profit organizations, SARChI, the work that was being done on the university campus. So we're living from the 70s and into the 80s as a diverse group of South Africans, black, white, colored, Indian, men, women, young, old. We are forming trade unions. We are doing public art at that time. And we get, I think, kind of a little bit off track because we don't understand that while we're talking about a non-racial country, and that is what we're striving towards, the white activists and the white cultural practitioners, we have so much more privilege than our black colleagues who we're working with, that it's a complicated relationship, okay? And I remember very famously in Junction Avenue Theatre Company, which I was part of, Rabela Machene, who you might know, he performed in Sophiatown, the actor. When we all traveled in the 1980s to Europe, and the critics asked Ramolau, so why do you work with these white people? And I thought, it's apartheid in South Africa. And he pointed at his stomach. And we were all very upset. Come on, Ramolau, we're comrades, we're working together. So it was the politics of the stomach, obviously, but there were all kinds of very interesting things happening, 1970s and 1980s, with respect to public art. And you might find this surprising to know, but the key figure was Christopher Till. Christopher Till started doing public art in Johannesburg from the 1980s. And I was just reminding Stephen, he comes into the job in 1984, director of the Johannesburg Art Gallery. In 1986, they build a new wing in 2 years. The head of the city who he's dealing with is an out-and-out racist. When he wants to commission the neglected tradition, the first history of black South African art, the city managers are saying, what are you talking about? And I won't tell you the words and the language that was used, the derogatory language, about this project of presenting black art in this institution of the city. So that is the moment of public art, and I think it goes up to about 1910, 1915, and then we have a crisis. And I watched that crisis unfold, and I experience it when I go to the Rissik Street Post Office, which they're refurbishing, and there's a plan to turn it into a museum, and I look out the door and I realize that the thresholds are broken, the city is broken, there's just so much destruction and decay, we can't even imagine that we can do anything in these public spaces. And so I come up with this notion of the D-public, D-E public, which is this period that we've just worked through. And then I think that what the future is about public performance. So one of the things that we discovered when we were working in the city, that every time we did public art and put a memorial or a monument into public space, we needed to be able to engage with communities. Communities wanted to participate. They wanted an event. And there was never the budget to do it, okay? And so you ended up with an object in a public space and no potential to animate it. And even you wanted to do a consultation. I mean, these guys were brilliant at taking the budget and enabling the budget to allow for consultation towards the development of a piece of public sculpture. But I think what our city cries out for now is reclaiming public space, making it safe, street markets, festivals, animation. This is where we have to go. Now it's difficult because with public art, it's easy. The financial instrument is the capital grant, and you spend up to 1% on the public art. Performance is time-bound. You don't deliver anything other than an experience. And so that would have to come from a fund like the National Arts Council. So we have to see how we set up a policy going forward so that we can reanimate public space. So that, in a nutshell, is what I've done. I just want to read you one quote and then I will stop. Carlos Amato, the cartoonist, and he writes about soccer. He's just been in Mexico City, and he wrote a post saying, in Mexico City, public space is exactly that. Street traders can operate freely in covered central pavements near major sites. Beggars can beg from restaurant patrons. They aren't chased away. Musicians of any quality can stroll onto any bus and busk, and the driver and passengers are Mingawari. We need a Joburg more like Mexico City. Thank you.